projects there. But it didn't take me too long to realize what an insidious problem that was. Is I saw so many people vote for things that they knew were wrong for the country, that were wasteful, in order to get things to take back to their state or to their district. It essentially perverted the whole purpose of a Congress working for the good of the whole, of good of the American people. So much parochialism and so much what was really a built-in special interest of people trying to take a part of the federal budget back home rather than apply it to the good of the country. This is just part of the waste in the system, and Senator Jeff Flake, and we served together in the House, has been a great warrior against waste in government, against excessive spending, against debt, which has got our country, I think, at a precipice of a crisis if we don't figure out how to turn it around. And I've heard a number of people say that we don't really need to work on things like earmarks. It's just $18, $20 billion a year. But what I found, if you're not willing to address the smaller things, there's no way you're going to deal with big things like entitlement spending or built-in waste throughout the system. So I'm thankful that Jeff has taken the mantle of great budget fighters like Tom Coburn and several others, but there are not many who are willing to step forward and to target these different things, because everything you target has some special interest behind it, who probably makes Jeff Flake very unpopular with a number of groups. But here at Heritage, Jeff, you're very popular for being willing to stand up for hopefully continuing the earmark ban. It was almost inconceivable when I heard that they were going to try to lift that in the House, but also waste throughout government and what it does to pervert the purpose of serving the people of the United States. So I'm just honored to introduce a great friend of mine, a warrior of waste in government, Senator Jeff Flake.
Thank you, Jim. Well, thank you so much, Jim. One of the great honors I've had is to serve with Jim DeMint in the House, and I learned a lot from him and have watched him, obviously, when he got to the Senate and then in this position. As the executive director of the Goldwater Institute during most of the 90s, I made my way to Heritage quite often. If I recall, the digs weren't quite this good. This a lot more plush and a lot more spacious, and it speaks well of what's been done here, that you've been able to expand and grow, not just in size, but certainly in influence. So I appreciate being here. Now, amidst all the celebrations this month in the nation's capital, there's one milestone that will be met that Washington would rather not talk about. Within days, our national debt will surpass $20 trillion. That's the largest amount ever owed by any government in history. And when our government's authority to borrow expires in March, we're going to have another one of those debates about the debt ceiling. But even to this day of fiscal reckoning, there are politicians on both sides of the aisle who are focusing on new ways to spend money. There is even, as Jim mentioned, a strong push to revive the corrupt practice of earmarking. Now, it seems that the same members of Congress that are taking pride and pleasure in the authority that the Constitution grants the Congress are, I think, misrepresenting what the Constitution really says about the congressional role of spending. I'm here to make the case that the framers never intended for the power of the purse to be the power to distribute pork. Now, placed within the list of powers denied to Congress, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 is actually a limitation on government spending. It says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. The power of the purse, therefore, is not a mandate for Congress to spend freely, but rather the duty to prevent the executive branch from spending freely. It says that money that has not been appropriated, or funds for the purpose that have not been authorized by representatives of the people. That's what Congress is to make sure of, that the executive branch doesn't move ahead spending money at will. Its purpose is to safeguard the public treasury from waste, fraud, and abuse. Spending is further prohibited or protected from the whims of Congress by being limited to carry out only those duties that were enumerated to the federal government elsewhere in the Constitution. Now, even with the broadest interpretation of the General Welfare Clause, it is a big stretch to point to the power of the purse to justify congressional earmarks, such as the Teapot Museum in North Carolina, the indoor rainforest in Iowa, or Bridges to Nowhere in Alaska. These types of parochial pork are the exact opposite of the general welfare. In simple terms, an earmark steers taxpayer money to a politician's hand-selected pet project. And earmarking has been abused to reward campaign donors and political supporters. We saw that in spades in the House. A couple of our colleagues ended up in jail for the practice. It has also been used as a form of currency to buy and sell the votes of politicians. One lobbyist convicted of corruption dubbed earmarks the congressional favor factory. Let's not forget that the deciding vote for Obamacare was secured with an earmark for Nebraska, derided as the Cornhusker kickback. Now, after losing control of the House in 2006, in large part due to scandals associated with earmarks, I helped lead the effort to enact a moratorium on earmarking when Republicans retook the House in 2010. I've often said when I got to Congress, my background was, I grew up in Snowflake, Arizona, a small town. I grew up on a ranch on the F-Bar. And one of my jobs as a small kid was my dad would put me on what we called the tank bank, which was a reservoir overlooking our alfalfa fields, where in the springtime we'd graze some of our cattle on those fields. And the first cutting of alfalfa, when it grows slowly as it's just warming up, is very leafy, and it's very good and nutritious, but it also causes cattle sometimes to eat too much and to bloat. So this job that my dad would put me on, he called bloat watch. And I would be up on that tank bank where I could oversee the field. And if a critter were to go on its side, there's a difference between a cow sitting or just laying down and being bloated. And you quickly recognize the sign. The cow will be on its side with 4 feet sticking out to the side. And my job was to go with a big knife and to make sure that the left side of the critter was exposed, and to take the knife and stab. I'm sorry for the graphic nature of this, but that's what we did. You stab just behind the rib on the left side, and haylage would sometimes spew up several feet in the air, coming down on both boy and bovine alike. But if all went well, the critter would, after a time, stand up and thank you. Well, not really, but then go on eating again. And that was the only way to save cows bloating. I've often thought, after getting to Congress, that I'm on bloat watch again. It's a little different, obviously, but some of the mechanics the same. Government has become far too bloated. Now, on the Senate side, while we were working on the House to upend earmarks, a successful crusade was done here by and led by someone we all know, and that's Jim DeMint. And I want to say how much, again, I appreciate him for the work that he has done on this subject. If it were not for Jim DeMint, we'd probably still have earmarks today. Now, the Democrats were forced to join us when we gained an unexpected ally in this fight in Barack Obama. If you remember, he was only in the Senate for a couple of years before he started campaigning for president. He had little time to ingratiate himself or to become part of the practice of earmarking. So when he got to the White House, he threatened to veto any bill containing earmarks and that did help us in the practice. Yet now there are a few members, as mentioned, who are pushing to end the moratorium we have on earmarks, with reassurances that this time it will be different. Now, taxpayers know that these promises are just hogwash. You can't drain the swamp when you're feeding pork to the alligators. Now, this afternoon, I'll offer a proposal to the Senate Republican Conference. This will be a proposal to the rules that will reaffirm our support for the existing ban on congressional earmarks. We have to do this when every new Congress comes up. In the coming weeks, I'll introduce legislation that will hopefully permanently ban earmarks from legislation. Now, while ending Pork Belt projects will reduce reduce wasteful spending, it will not end it altogether. We know this. That's why the power of the purse must be restored to its originally intended purpose, which is why I argue that we need to empower Congress to stop unnecessary spending. We've got to have more oversight of the executive branch. This second part of the same clause of the Constitution provides Congress providing Congress control over appropriations includes another important duty requiring the publish of a, quote, regular statement and account of receipts and expenditures of all public money. The word all makes the level of detail Washington is obligated to provide taxpayers very clear. It means all. However, anyone who's read through an appropriations bill or the president's budget knows that it's nearly impossible to account for or verify exactly what Congress intends or what the president is ordering being spent. Missing from these documents are itemized breakdowns of expenditures totaling thousands, millions, and even billions of dollars that would probably not survive taxpayer scrutiny, such as a $560,000 item to run shrimp on a treadmill, or $5 million to throw parties for hipsters. These omissions are not an oversight, but a purposeful effort to avoid oversight. Now, when the statement and account clause was drafted, the framers most likely did not have something in mind like Wastebook. But my friend and former colleague, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, created Wastebook, an annual report detailing some of the outrageous ways Washington wastes your money in an effort to bring transparency and federal spending the way the founders intended. Now, today, I'm continuing Tom Coburn's crusade by releasing the latest installment, profiling 50 examples of questionable expenditures, collectively costing about $5.5 billion. You'll each be provided of this book today. Roland, who's in the audience, is very clever at ways to tie it to popular media coming up. So this one is titled Porkymon Go. Last year was a Star Wars theme with a movie being released. The top entry in this year's book is a spaceport, which is just a fancy word for a rocket launch site in Alaska. It was derided as space pork because Congress used earmarks to force the Department of Defense to build a facility over the objections of the military. This was part of an illegal kickback scheme. A mid-level DOD employee sentenced to prison for masterminding this plot. He confessed that building the launch facility, quote, doesn't make sense, and that the Pentagon, quote, just paid for meaningless work. While it sat unused for several years, the Pentagon is now sinking another $80 million into this spaceport, even though it's not equipped with the type of missiles that DOD plans to launch from the site. This is typical of a lot of the programs that we have going. We're started with an earmark, and now we simply continue with another entry in this year's Wastebook. The National Comedy Center in New York, obviously they're laughing all the way to the bank here, with a $1.7 million grant from the Economic Development Administration that will bring Lucille Ball and other classic comedians who are no longer with us back to the stage as holograms. You'll see that. I'm not kidding here. This would seem funny, and it's a comedy club, but unfortunately it's your tax dollars. Also seeming to live forever, a very nutty Department of Agriculture programs that allows taxpayer-backed loans to be literally repaid with peanuts. We shelled out $74 million this year for a pile of peanuts so big that the federal government simply can't give them away. Under this program, a farmer can keep the money that was loaned while the federal government takes ownership of surplus peanuts. So peanut farmers are given a loan at the end of the year. If the market price isn't high enough, they can simply unload those peanuts on the federal government. In typical Washington fashion, the government pays obviously more for the peanuts than the market price would be. And it's turned this crop into a cash cow, obviously. And voila, it encourages the production of even more peanuts. We are storing these in warehouses all over the country, spending millions of dollars now. It could grow into the hundreds of millions of dollars every year just to store the peanuts. In fact, we decided, well, we got to do something with these peanuts. So the federal government tried to offload some of them in Haiti a while ago to maybe help after earthquake relief. But the problem is, as the U.S. Department of Agriculture was doing this, USAID was trying to help Haitians learn to grow peanuts. And it obviously depressed that market. And so you have two federal government agencies combating each other with your tax dollars. 6 years after the Federal Railroad Administration awarded more than $3 billion to build a high-speed passenger train in California, not a single track has been laid. Billions over budget and years behind schedule. The only thing high-speed about this train is how quickly it's chewing your tax dollars. And for that joke, you can blame Roland or Jason from my office, all the bad puns that come with this. But billions over budget is a way to describe just about all of these programs. Here's another. Instead of filling potholes, the Department of Transportation spent $35,000 to display a giant glow-in-the-dark doobie in Denver to serve as a dubious reminder that motorists should not drive while they're stoned. So a big picture of a joint hanging from a building in Colorado, no less, brought to you by your tax dollars. Even the nation's most prestigious science agencies are spending taxpayer funds investigating subjects that most would consider either obvious or absurd. Researchers were literally playing with dolls to prove what every child already knows. Girls are more likely to play with Barbie dolls than boys. They did this with $300,000 in grants from both the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Now, studies of the habits of college students funded with $5 million in NIH grants counted more than 500 different drinking games that are popular on college campuses. According to the researchers, quote, all the games have the same goal, causing participants to become intoxicated. I think that falls into the obvious category. They observed that fraternity brothers drink, smoke, and generally party more than other students. They also tend to sleep in. I like this one. This led the researchers to speculate, quote, one explanation for this finding is that the students at Greek fraternities recognize their sleep needs. I think a more likely reason is that they were sleeping it off the next day. But that's your tax dollars at work as well. Now, I think perhaps the only surprise finding is that fraternity brothers and sorority sisters are, quote, more likely to report consuming alcohol after participating in an alcohol abuse intervention. The monkey business doesn't end there. NIH spent nearly $1 million to study the evolution of monkey drool and another $230,000 to determine if the color red makes female monkeys feel more romantic. It does, by the way. As part of an effort supported by both NSF and DoD to teach computers how to study human behavior, machines were actually programmed to binge-watch television shows. After viewing 600 hours of Desperate Housewives and The Office, among other shows, The computers were still unable to predict how humans would behave in most situations. Anybody who watches shows like that, they're rather predictable, but not to the computers, I guess. Now, spending nearly $500,000 to train computers or to turn computers into couch potatoes doesn't compute for me. NASA is spending more than $1 million to prepare the world's religions for the possible discovery of extraterrestrial life forms. Think about that. NASA, when they complain about not having enough money, spending more than $1 million to prepare the world's religions for the possible discovery of extraterrestrial life forms. But perhaps the fishiest study of them all tested how long a fish can run on a treadmill. You've all heard this for years. We've had shrimp on a treadmill. We've had sheep on a treadmill. We had monkeys in a hamster ball on a treadmill. But now, mud skippers. Mud skippers possess the ability to live out of water for an extended period of time and to use their fins like legs. They're forced to run for as long as 15 minutes at a time as part of a study paid for with a $565,000 grant from NSF. The list goes on and on and on. Now, this year's edition of the Wastebook, as I mentioned, is called Pokemon Go, because just like the monsters in the popular Pokemon Go game, I have to consult my kids about this one, government boondoggles come in all shapes and sizes and pop up just about everywhere. Wastebook Pokemon Go provides an index for Congress, as well as the incoming administration and taxpayers, about some of the questionable expenditures lurking in the federal budget that collectively cost taxpayers more than $5 billion. Now, to reduce the debt, control the cost and size of the federal government, and to restore the intent of the power of the purse to protect taxpayers, our mission is simple. You got to catch them all. Thank you for having me here, and I'd be glad to answer a couple of questions. Yes.
Yes, Senator, thank you for being here. Question, it seems some of our problems go back to the meaning of words. You know, we call money what is not really money. Money was what the Constitution said, gold and silver coin. And even taxpayers, well, we pay taxpayers in Federal Reserve credit, but of course, yeah, Congress can create, or through the mechanism of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, can spend much more credit than is attributable to taxpayers. So would restoring an honest constitutional monetary unit where, you know, even under our old tax system where the federal taxes were apportioned among the states rather than, you know, credit directly taxed from individuals, wouldn't it restore some integrity and honesty to the system?
Well, the role of the Fed is obviously has a dual role. I think they spend too much time on the second one than the first one. The first one is to make sure we have a stable currency. Some believe that we ought to change what our currency is backed by. I'll leave that discussion to Ron Paul and Rand Paul and others. I just think that for us to continue to accrue the debt that we're accruing, as I mentioned, we'll hit $20 trillion, and we're still running $500 billion deficits. And if you look at the projections that the CBO has put forward for the next decade, it's not pretty. Unless we get a hold of our entitlement spending. And what's really worrisome to me, my biggest worry, what keeps me up at night is worrying that we'll wake up one morning and the financial markets will have already decided that we're no longer a good bet, and that foreign governments or sovereign wealth funds or others will demand a little premium. And that all of a sudden will cause interest rates to increase, and where we're only spending $285 billion a year, I believe, to service our debt now. If interest rates tick up just a couple of percentage points, we're doubling, tripling that amount. And pretty soon all of our discretionary budget is consumed just servicing the debt. So we've got to get serious about it, and I agree completely with Jim. Some people may say, well, this is what you're talking about is earmark spending or just frivolous spending by the agencies. The real, culprit is entitlement spending. That is true. But earmarks and this kind of spending are, as Senator Coburn called it, the gateway drug to spending addiction. And it's unlikely we're going to tackle the big items unless we tackle the small items like this. So, yes.
Thank you, Senator, for this great work. I'm particularly impressed by the detailed sourcing, which is very helpful. I imagine a lot of work went into this. One of my questions is, is it difficult to determine what is wasteful, what's frivolous, and what is proper government activity? I think some of the research studies in particular, many in here, they sound very funny, so it helps guide us to say, maybe this wasn't such a good use of taxpayer money. But are there any objective criteria that the Congress could put on agencies to help rein in some of this waste? Or are there any other ways that you could imagine that Congress could exercise more oversight and effectively reduce some of these wasteful activities?
Well, thank you. That's a good point. And some of the, I think that one of the laudable functions as the federal government is doing some basic research that, isn't being done elsewhere, and can't be done because there's simply no market for it. Some of the disease research that we do, I think, is important and should continue. It would be hard to make the case, and I haven't seen a compelling case for us spending money, $5 million, to study the drinking habits of fraternities. Those kind of things is hardly basic research. There's a lot of things going there, and in other areas as well, a lot of research that is being done in the market already doesn't need to be done by the federal government. And some of these things, curiosity about whether or not, one of the items in this year's Wastebook is whether dinosaurs can sing. Or could sing, I should say. I'm not suggesting they're back. But there, was a study, a couple $100,000 to determine whether or not they could sing. That'd be interesting to know. Do they really roar like in Jurassic Park movies? But it's, given the other priorities that we have, it's tough to make the case that that's something we ought to be studying right now with federal taxpayer dollars. With regard to what Congress can do, what worries me more than anything about getting back to the earmarking era is Jim and I saw it during the height of earmarking, which probably hit its nadir in 2005 with the transportation bill with, I think, 16,000 earmarks in it, worth about $30 billion. What you have when you have a situation like that is the Appropriations Committee, virtually all of their time, resource, and energy was spent during those times in allocating earmarks for members, just making sure that they got their piece of the pie, and spent very little time, if any time, providing oversight of the federal agencies for programs that had already been authorized. And so it's a resource issue more than anything. Once you get back to the earmark era, I can tell you that's where the time and resources go. And for those who defend earmarks by saying it's only about 1% of the federal budget, that is true. Why in the world would we spend that much time as a Congress focused on 1% of spending and virtually ignoring the 99% that's occurring? And so we need to step up our oversight. And you can do that not just in the Appropriations Committee, but in the authorizing committees as well, and making sure that we aren't spending money on programs that aren't authorized or are no longer authorized. Great question. One more, and then the sessions hearings are going on, and that's my committee, so I better run back to that. But thank you.
Thank you, Senator Flake. I want to continue the discussion on research because publications like this are really at best incomplete on the research projects, and at worst, misleading and disingenuous. There's a context to all this research that you don't leave room to go into detail. And worse, you don't really ask the scientists to help explain or justify the work. You say there's no compelling case for the drinking research. I'll bet there is. I'll bet you should have asked for it. I think that would have made a big difference. reports like this make it look as if NIH is asleep at the wheel, and letting stuff in that doesn't meet standards. I don't think that's true, but I think you feed a false narrative with a report like this.
I think whenever you put a report out there, obviously we're saying to the agencies, come and justify it. They should. I actually attended last year. There was an event where some of the researchers came into the Russell Senate office building.
Put that together.
Yeah, and I went and viewed it, and it was informative. And like I said, some of this is basic research. A lot of it is not. A lot of it is research that is happening elsewhere through market-driven incentives, and some of it is just interesting things that we might want to know, but it's tough to justify given other priorities that we have at the federal level. So I certainly take your point that sometimes it's an incomplete picture of what's going on. But we do want those who are receiving these grants to actually come forward and say, hey, why is this important? Why is it the federal government that needs to fund this research? And that's a good conversation to have, and I hope we spark that. So thank you. Thank you again for having me here.